All right, we are recording and welcome everyone. My name is Roseanne Service and you are watching Uplift. And so today we are with Brent Ashworth, and Uplift is a very special group where we talk one-on-one with people and provide positive perspectives to faith doubts or faith questions. And joining me today is the amazing Brent Ashworth. He has had an amazing life story. He's been through so many things. Some of you may recognize him from the documentary that has been gaining popularity right now called Murder Among the Mormons. But also, he is a very amazing person. And so I'd love for Brent to introduce himself just briefly. Go
Well,
ahead.
thank you, Roseanne. It's an honor to be here. And I started out growing up in Provo, Utah. As a shaver, I was actually born in the Bay Area, but my dad was in architecture school at the time. And we moved here when I was only about a year old.
Mhm.
And I've been inspired by my grandmother to collect. And my parents helped along the way too. But my grandmother, we called her Nana, Ethel Lenore Adamson Brailsford, um, was a real pack rat. And my wife says there's only room in a family for one collector. I think she'd like to revise that since our collection is over 1 million items now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, one collector may be too many. But my grandmother collected about everything, she had invitations to dances or letters or books. She could only get up to the eighth grade, uh, as my mother told me, because she couldn't afford a 50-cent English book, which wouldn't allow her to go to the eighth grade. So,
Mhm.
as my father put it, she was the most well-educated person he ever met. She didn't allow a lack of schooling to stand in the way of her getting an education. And she would go to the library once a week, a habit my mother picked up from her, and pick up 5 or 6 books, and she'd have them read by the next Wednesday when she went and got some more. And she could tell you the storylines of every book she ever read. Well, that's what I was told about her because she died when I was only year and a half old of cancer, and that's the disease that finally took my mother at age 49 too. But she was quite an influence on me, and I feel like I know her, even though our paths didn't last too long here on this earth. And I was really impressed with the fact that she was a collector. My grandfather, he and I became very close after her death. He died when I was only 7. And those of you know where Brick Oven Restaurant is in Provo, it was the west parking lot. It was his home. That home was moved out to Linden. It's still around on a new foundation. There's a couple of big trees out in front of there that I helped him wrap up the day he passed away in 1956. And any rate, a great man. He had given me a job that day to cut down a limb off a tree in the back that the wind had blown down. And my father was always giving me toolkits. I think being a carpenter and an architect later, he was always hopeful that I'd pick up those skills. I don't think I ever did, but I was uh, pleased to have that opportunity. And I cut up the branch and went up to his place. And my mother, we lived downstairs. He lived up. My mother said, "Well, Pop's really ill tonight, so maybe you can come in the morning to get your 50 cents." And in the morning, he'd passed away by then. And but he told my mother before he died, "Hey, my pants are hanging over there on the door. Get a 50-cent piece for Brent. I owe it to him." So that told me right off. I've carried that 50-cent piece the rest of my life, and told me right off, what it meant to make a commitment, especially to a young kid. So that was impressed. So I was impressed to get into historical things from my grandparents, and then my parents were very enthusiastic. My father had survived Iwo Jima in World War II, was a CB construction battalion, and he used to tell the story about the famous flag raising, the most famous picture of World War II, by saying the day before the flag was raised on Mount Suribachi that he and his fellow CBs, construction battalion guys, went in with their picks and shovels and built a road up Mount Suribachi while they were getting shot at, because the enemy has had tunnel system all the way up the mountain and all the way through the island. And the next day he had had a small injury to his foot. It wasn't serious, was wrapped up. And and they looked up on the mountain from the USS Salt Lake City, which he transferred to, heavy cruiser, because he said that was as close to home as he'd ever get. And they could see a Jeep up on top. And it wasn't his turn for the binoculars, but they were close enough to the hill to see the second flag raising go up, which was the famous one. And well, at any rate, he told me many years later as a kid, it helped inspire me to want to collect. He used to say that the gyrenes, as he called them, went in the next day. The Marines were part of the Navy then. Gyrenes, he said, went in the next day, took our road that we built, took the hill, found a pipe, stuck up the flag, and stole the glory. And since I was in the Army during Vietnam, I can kind of relate a little to the inter-service rivalry, but it inspired me, his stories, to help to want to collect American history. And then my mother, she grew up in Cody, Wyoming, as kind of a tomboy in cowboy outfits, and told me a lot about the West, about Buffalo Bill and her town, that founded her town, and other things. And my grandparents were pioneers on both sides too. So I had a lot of heritage, which led to my interest. And I can remember Pop coming home one day when I was a 7-year-old saying he sure wished he could pull his car in the garage, but he didn't have the heart to go through grandma's things after she died. The kids didn't have that compunction at all. And after he passed away in 1956, they just built a big bonfire out back and started throwing everything in. And I remember
Oh
as a
no.
kid watching this fire and thinking, boy, what's gone up in the flames? I can still remember Grandpa's Pop's false teeth in the ashes and wondering what else they weren't looking at. My uncles were just dumping stuff in. And the only other thing I remember about that day was two uncles fighting over a pair of socks. And I asked my mother later when I was a deacon in the church, I said, did you guys save anything of Nana's stuff? And she says, well, the books were saved. They were divided up. But as far as the papers, they were destroyed, except for one box, she said, that was up in the garage, in the rafters. And we moved upstairs after Pop died, and my father was designing a home on the East Bench in Provo at the time, up above where the Provo Temple is now. And she said, well, we saved that one box. And I pester and pester. I was just a deacon at the time until we went out to the garage and found the box. And she said, without going through it, you can just have it. It's probably more junk. In that box were 12 letters of Heber J. Grant written to my grandmother between 1931 and 1933, when they had sent their oldest son, my uncle, on a mission to Texas. And that was the Great Depression. And my grandfather, who literally worked with J.C. Penney in founding the first J.C. Penney store in Utah, which incidentally was at Eureka, if anybody wants to answer a trivia question, in 1910. He felt that the boy should be sent home from the mission. She was a convert to the church, Nana, and had drug him into activity, and everyone else in the family. And he became very active after that. And their boy had been called to Texas in 31, and he didn't feel like he could continue to support son by sending $25 a month, which was standard then in the church. What is it, 400 and something now? So he thought the boy should come home, and my grandmother felt differently and wrote the president of the church, and he wrote all these letters back. They were all dictated with beautiful signatures, Heber J. Grant typed. And among them, he said, I think that you should keep the boy out on the mission, regardless of whether you can send him anything. We had a lot of missionaries go out without purse or script, and I would leave him that way. The Lord will provide. Well, I was reading these letters from 30 years later, 1961, and I thought, I know more about President Grant than anything I'd heard in junior Sunday school. Wouldn't it be nice if I could collect something of each president, prophet of the church? Every collector starts with a set in mind, and that was mine. And I've collected about 15 items from each of them from various areas of their stages of their lives since that time. The toughest ones are always the newer ones, like President Nelson, because people are hanging on to things right now, but I've gotten a few things of his too. And it's been a real inspiration. Frankly, I'd hate to have anybody like me collecting stuff that I had written when I was a teenager. But I've had items written from several of the prophets when they were teenagers. And it struck me a few years ago in thinking about it that I've never found anything that they wrote, even at a young age, which detracts from the position they later held. So it's just kind of an additional little fun witness from collecting their things. I have an English book that George Albert Smith at age 17 gave to his girlfriend, passed his book along with a message. It was just a lovely little message, you know, and
Oh,
I've never seen anything off color or anything that would detract from the position they later held. I have a feeling the Lord watches over each of us. And that's just one example. I think he watches over his prophets too, as they're growing up and different stages of their lives. So it's been impressive and it's been fun. And when I got done with collecting, collectors get bored after a while. And I started also in that box were letters of Louise Y. Robinson, a name which you may not recall now, but she was General Relief Society president back then. And she became very dear friends with my grandmother. In fact, they spent a lot of time together, and there were more letters for her than there were President Grant. But I started collecting the Relief Society sisters from Emma Smith on down, and I found that the women, not just in the church, but as I started collecting presidents of the United States and founding fathers and mothers of the country and others from world history over the years, that the women's autographs are much rarer than the men. And in fact, Martha Washington is 10 times rarer in handwriting than is George. Josephine Bonaparte's 10 times rarer than Napoleon. And certainly Emma Smith is 10 or 15 times rarer than the prophet Joseph Smith in handwriting. And I've kind of developed a theory over time on this. I've always felt that, well, perhaps who saves this stuff anyway? Generally, the wives or ladies outlive the men. And so I got to the opinion, maybe it's wrong, and I don't want to sound sexist at all, that maybe the women don't want you reading their mail, but they don't care about their husbands. You can read theirs. I don't know, but that's one theory.
You never know. You never know.
Just one theory that I've developed. But I've in the process, I've been looking for mostly throughout American history and throughout our history, the Latter-day Saint history. I've been looking for letters that touch on their spiritual beliefs and things that matter to them about their lives as they grow up, what made them great, and not just in their own sight maybe, but in the sight of our Heavenly Father. And I've picked up a few little tidbits over time that have been fun. I don't know if I can share a couple of them with you. We had
Feel free.
My book, Show and Tell, came out while we were serving a mission in Massachusetts a few years ago. And it was one that was inspired actually by Glenn Beck. If you know Glenn's a personal friend. And he said, Ashworth, we need to get your story written. And so we hired a couple of writers. The first one just wanted to meet Glenn. Here's me and Glenn. And the second one, Tracy Felstead, really wanted to write the history, and she had worked with the Springfield Museum of Art as a cataloger. And so for about 4 years, we worked together on this and put things together. And if you don't mind my just sharing a few little things from it, it's been fun to share things from both American and LDS history. For instance, you probably can't see this, but this is William Bradford's other Bible he brought to America, signed by him, which was printed in Leyden, Holland. That's in our collection, and he mentions it in his will. And then we have Joseph and Emma Smith's family Bible in our collection, and where the prophet has written the names of his family. And then Emma took the names of the Hale family, her family, and then each had 9 children. And then Emma continues to write the names of her children. I heard it somewhere in Meridian magazine somewhere that the Joseph Smith family Bible, that she'd never named the twins that she lost, but she sure did, and they're named Titus and Louisa, and they're right here in her Bible. Plus, she listed another child we didn't even know existed until this Bible was found in the 1970s among a family member. She's got Thomas, 7th son, February 6, 1842. Now, that shows the importance of keeping family records, because we didn't even know about the prophets and Emma's additional son that had lived one day and died. So record keeping is important. When the Lord commanded us to keep a record among you, it's interesting that even in the prophet's own family, we would have missed somebody if Emma hadn't written the name of their son down. And so it's quite inspiring, I think, to see how these things come together. And here's a picture of Nana here with me. I don't know if you can see that, but that's
Oh, wow.
I was too small to remember her, but I feel like I know her pretty well. And we had a great experience, and Pop's pictures under that. These are my parents when we were kids. My brother Mark and I were heading on eventually there were 4 children, but we were heading on a trip with them by rail to go pick up a 1954 Buick. I was 5 years old at there in Michigan, and Flint, Michigan, where they made Buicks at the time. And each family could order their own vehicle with their own colors. And my folks picked one with a white body and a turquoise top. And we were the third family when we got there by train. We were the third family to be in line, and the first 2 families picked up their cars, and then we hopped in ours and drove around the United States. And that was the first time I got to see Mount Rushmore as a kid and other things. It was very impressive. My folks took the time with us, which I think is one of the key things too. Not everybody's blessed with as good of parents as I had, but there are other mentors and so forth that the Lord places in our lives, I really believe, even if the parents don't work out that way, to kind of guide and direct us. And along the path, there were things that came my way that I really enjoyed. For instance, here's a letter here from, maybe I can just read it from, this is a letter after we lost our son in a terrible accident. Sam, our 7-year-old, had been involved in a bike car accident when he was 7. And it was just at the end of our street in the home my dad had designed that I told you about in the 50s. But this was in 1985. And we were out of town due to the Hofmann bombing. My in-laws, very fine people, said, you and Charlene, my wife, need to leave the state and come down and visit your uncle in La Jolla for a while and get out of that, pressure mill up there in Utah. And at the time, in the wake of the Hoffman bombings and so on. And we had actually been told by several people to get our family and to take off, which is the only time we ever ran in our lives. I had 3 attorney friends that told me to do that, but the call that got me going was from Jay Todd, the editor of the Ensign, who was a friend of mine at the time, and we'd worked on several articles and so on. And he called up and he says, it was right after they announced Mark as the 3rd bomb victim in that Hoffman thing that you saw in the Murder Among the Mormons. He said, the brethren wanted me to call and tell you to get your family and get them out of town. That's the call that got us moving. And so we went down to St. George. We were at the Coral Reef Inn, which I still think is there on the boulevard. And we were at the swimming pool with our little kids at the time. And a lady comes in and says, is there anybody named Brent Ashworth here? I says, well, that's me. She says, well, there's a guy on the phone that says he's the chief of police in Salt Lake. He wants to talk to you. And I thought, oh, brother. And so went and picked up the phone, and he says, this is Bud Willoughby, chief of police. We tracked you down. I'd been a prosecutor in Price after I got out of law school. And so I had worked with the police quite often and knew about them. But I was a bit disrespectful at this point. I got on the phone and I was very anxious to get my family back to Provo. And we never had a run before. And it wasn't fear for myself, it was for my family that we ran. And he said, well, we finally tracked you down. And he said, I just have a couple of questions for you. The first is, why didn't you meet with Mark last Wednesday at 2:15 like you'd done the previous 4 years? And I was amazed he knew that much information after 2 or 3 days. And I had to think back. And then I remembered that it was my wife that told me not to go up that day. I told her I was just going up to do a little legal work with our securities attorneys at Van Cup Bagley in the tower and Key Bank Tower in Crossroads Mall, and to visit with Mark. She says, I don't know, I just don't think you should go. So for once, I listened to her, and we stayed home, ate pizza, and watched a movie. And our daughter ran in later that afternoon after they announced Hoffman had been blown up, thinking that Hoffman was our friend. We didn't tell her about our run-ins and stuff with him, uh, and at that point we had calls for us to leave, so we left. And when we came back, it was her folks that after the chief of police call, the other thing he wanted me to do was to come back and help him with the case. He said, "You spent more time with us with Mark Hofmann than his wife did the last 4 years," which I didn't take as a compliment at that time, because he was their prime
No.
suspect, and I thought they had the wrong guy for about 3 weeks.
Mhm.
Um, but at any rate, what convinced me he was the right guy was I was working with the police at the time, I guess because I'd been a prosecutor and now I was a victim. They let me go through all the stuff from his burned out car and house. Kenny Farnsworth, who has since passed away, and whose widow gave uh, the Netflix people the pictures of the two death scenes um, that he had. Brought a box of burn stuff into me one day. I was working with him on Wednesdays. My son by then was in critical care after his accident when we were out of town, which I think is hard for us to not relate, because we were out of town due to the Hoffman thing when he was hit by these teenagers. Anyway, he was in critical condition, and my wife was taking the days and I the nights at the hospital. So I was working with the police on Wednesdays rather than visiting with Mark anymore or seeing our attorneys. And Kenny brings in this box of burn material and just puts it in front of me. I look at it for a minute and I notice that it's all catalogs similar to the ones I get in books, manuscripts, things like that. But they were from Mark's car. And I noticed, even though they were burned, that they still had the wrappers on them, that they still had staples in them, that they'd never been opened, that there were no markings on them other than being burned. And Kenny left me with that stuff for about 10 minutes and came back in. And I says, "You're right. He's probably guilty of murder." And he says, "Well, what changed your mind?" I says, "Well, he wasn't what I thought he was. First thing anybody does in our business is open their catalogs. And he obviously didn't need to." So that's a little bit of a detour around our son's accident. But let me just say this about it. You can ask me whatever questions you'd like on it. It was by far the toughest part of this era in our lives was our son's accident. Ultimately, he passed away 6 months after his accident. But there were an awful lot of prayers and a lot of wonderful people that helped us during that time and period.
How old was he? He was
He was
just young?
7. He was 7. Yeah.
And so he was hit by a car. Is that
Yeah,
how?
we never allowed our kids on bikes. I was serving as a bishop for the second time at that point at BYU. I'd been a bishop of a homeward in Payson. And it's interesting that both Steve Christensen, who was murdered, and Gary Sheets, who was a target, we were all bishops at the time. Isn't that weird? That's never been brought out.
Yeah.
And actually, Al Russ, the coin dealer, had been one, and was a dear friend too. Well, any rate, it was just a very interesting period. And yeah, he was 7 at the time. We had been kind of convinced that we should come down to La Jolla. Charlene and I get away from what we'd done, and I felt very impressed that we should not leave the kids at home. In fact, I made my wife. I dictated to her all of the little releases and stuff that a doctor should have and everything. We'd never had done that before. If there were an accident or if there were any problems. And I felt that twice. I kind of ignored it. And when I was at the MTC in a branch presidency there years ago, I used to tell the missionaries the story and tell them that you don't ignore the spirit. If you get an impression um, uh, at any time from our Father in heaven through the Spirit, you should follow it. And that's one thing that I learned from this event. And when our son was hit, they were out playing on their bikes, which we never allowed them on Sunday to do. But my younger brother, Kit, who passed away last year, 2 years ago now, and his wife were in charge, taking charge of them. But they had to leave our family for a period of about an hour and a half to go down and feed the missionaries at the MTC. That was their church assignment. And it was during that time that the accident took place. Well, the devil will take advantage of anything, I think, even a period like this.
Yeah.
And so they were very distraught over the whole thing as well. But that left our 12-year-old daughter, Amy Jo, in charge with her 5 little boys, little sons, little brothers who wouldn't listen to her. And our son Sam grabbed his big brother John's brand new bike, which he'd never been on before. And he said, "Race you to the corner, John. We're on a hill that feeds down to a feeder road." And so he hopped on his bike, and the other 4 boys chased behind him and saw the accident when it happened. Our son had never gotten on a bike with handbrakes before, so he probably didn't know how to slow down, but he was 7 years old. And these 3 teenagers have been up drinking and shooting on the hill all day. They were 19 years old. They should have been on missions. They weren't ready for that yet, I guess. And the driver, who since passed away, he was a young guy. Not due to this accident, but just a year or so ago, he passed away. He sped up when he saw our son and hit him, and our son hit the windshield and flew over the car, landed in the street. And for all intensive purposes, people thought he was gone. The car, the Camaro that they were driving in, went upside down in our neighbor's yard, the Markhams. And the photograph in the Daily Herald paper we didn't see for months later, but it was a photograph of this car upside down with guns and spent beer cans all over the yard, all over the front yard. No wonder those 3 kids just had a few, they were skinned up a little. They weren't seriously hurt. But anyway, one of them in the back seat that came to the only one that came to the funeral said that eventually that our son looked perplexed when they hit him. And he probably didn't realize, that he had to stop the bike either. So it was a disaster with just, a common thread in our society that happens. Our young daughter ran down, and she and her best friend jumped into the ambulance when it showed up. But before that happened, as he was laying in the street, they thought he was gone. Our stake president was just coming back from his meetings and driving up the hill and saw the commotion, stopped, grabbed our neighbor, and they provided a priesthood blessing to him. And that's when our daughter noticed that his chest started moving again. And so she hopped in the ambulance with her best friend, and they went down to the hospital. We were told that night that he probably wouldn't survive. Dr. Gaffane was the best brain doctor we had in Utah at that time. In fact, he was called back when Brady was shot with Reagan. He was called back to tender Brady's brain injuries at that time. An excellent doctor. But he called us. They finally got a hold of us down in La Jolla, and he told us that we don't think your son's going to make it, but in order to provide for the swelling of the brain, we've got to crack his skull, which didn't crack, during the hit. So, and put a shunt in. And so we were very nervous about that. He said that the aorta had been cut, which turns out it had not been. There were some tender mercies there, but he was in very bad shape. And we couldn't. It was when President Reagan had grounded all the air controllers, so there were no flights out. And we wanted to get out of San Diego really quick, and we couldn't. My father-in-law was with us, and he had a pilot's license. He'd been at D-Day during World War II, like my dad was at EWA. We had the war pretty well covered between our 2 dads. But strong guy, and he wanted to pilot a plane back, but he couldn't find a plane that wasn't grounded. So we had to wait till the Hawaiian special got in the next morning, and that was the longest night of our lives as parents. And those of you that have struggled over children that have been involved in terrible accidents or mishaps or lost one will know what I'm talking about. It's a very unique situation that people that haven't been there, I don't think, can quite feel for it. At any rate, we were up all night talking to the doctor and nurses, and he was providing updates and so on. And when we went to the airport and then flew to Utah, we thought, gee, I wonder if our son's even going to be alive when we get back. And there was a whole coterie of friends and people from the ward. You know how we surround those that have uh, big concerns like this or family problems. And we had some wonderful neighbors that we didn't realize had lost a son in their early marriage who were there to console us too. And so we went to the hospital, found he was still alive. He was wrapped up. His head was wrapped, but the front of his head looked fine. He took it with the back, I guess, of his head. And he was in a deep coma, deep sleep. And he was in a deep coma for about 2.5 months. In fact, there was one night, I took the nights. My wife was pregnant with our future son, Luke, who was so any of you that remember Luke Ashworth was a wide receiver for BYU football later, but she was pregnant with him at the time. And so it was a very difficult time for her in particular. And so she took the days when I was gone during the days, and I took the nights. We decided, because we'd had a son in the hospital years before, we'd never leave a child overnight in the hospital, and they didn't have really a place to take care of parents at that time. And so the nurses were very kind there at Utah Valley, and they allowed me to move from bed to bed until they needed it. Would move me out during the middle of the night as I was trying to catch a little sleep too, while he was in intensive care. And I was spending my Wednesdays still going to Salt Lake, but just to visit with the police rather than dealing with our legal people. And of course, Hofmann was in jail, or not, for a while. And so any rate, it was 3 weeks into this, on the night before Thanksgiving. The accident was November 2nd. And it was the night before Thanksgiving that year. And I came in, my wife really looked tired. I'd been up with the police that day. It was a Wednesday. And she looked really worn out, shot. And I didn't want to bother her, but as I got there to replace her and let her go home, one of my best friends came from my job that I worked with for many years. And Joe wanted to talk about our son. And I learned early on that you don't talk about coma patients in front of them. They might be able to hear that. And so he was in awfully bad shape. And so I said, well, Joe, let's go down the hall. So we did. I hated leaving her. She looked really distraught that night. And she had said before Joe showed up, she said, tomorrow's Thanksgiving, and I've done absolutely nothing to prepare for it. And in my inimitable fashion to say the wrong thing at the wrong time, I said, well, dear, we have absolutely nothing to be grateful for tonight, so don't worry about it. The combination of the Hofmann thing, and particularly our son being in the hospital, potentially terminal situation, had came out that way. And as I went down the hall with Joe to talk about our son, I felt badly about having said that. I'm sure we've all said things in the heat of life that we wish we could take back. That was one of mine, one of many. At any rate, one of mine. And I went back down the hallway out of range where he could hear me, and told Joe for about 20 minutes what the doctors had said, and so on and so on. And I came back, and her whole disposition had changed. It was almost like she was happy all of a sudden. And I thought, well, man, what happened there? And she said, well, as soon as you left, the phone rang, and I picked up the phone. It was a man's voice. And he said, is this the room of Brent Ashworth's son? And she said, yes. And he says, is this Sister Ashworth? I said, yes. Well, this is Gordon Hinckley in Salt Lake. And I just wanted to call and tell you that I'm putting your son's name on the prayer roll of the First Presidency and the 12, that we can add our faith to yours in his behalf. Now, he could have called anybody in the church, but I was so grateful. And I had a long time relationship with President Hinckley during the 80s. But I was so grateful that my wife got that call. And it made all the difference in the world. It was the only time that we all went home. We figured the First Presidency and the 12 are praying for us. Our son will be fine, whatever happens. So we all went home, and my stepmother, wonderful lady, she's still alive in her 90s, 94. Dad passed away many years ago. But at any rate, she fixed a wonderful Thanksgiving dinner. And we had a great Thanksgiving dinner. For 2 hours, we forgot about our troubles and celebrated the Lord's blessings. And it was great. My dad wrote a nice letter to President Hinckley the next day, thanking him for that call. Any rate, I tell you that because I think it shows the workings of the Lord through his leaders, and how the Lord gets things done oftentimes through each one of us, not just leaders, but each one of us have opportunities, if we're in tune with the Spirit, to help one another out of these terrible situations. One of the things I learned about my son's accident is, and of course, being a bishop at the time, having been one and having exercised a priesthood, whether I was a bishop or not, the fact of the matter was that every father that has a priesthood wants to give his child a blessing, particularly at a time like this. And I found with my wife in the room too, that I felt restrained every time I tried to give our son a blessing. My wife and I both knew what we wanted to ask the Lord, and I didn't feel like I could say it. Every time I wanted to say, "You'll be perfectly well," or "You'll be made well," or whatever, I couldn't say it. And that was really, I got to the point early on that I was upsetting her and me, and so I thought, and probably the Lord too, because I couldn't say anything that I really wanted to say. And I just asked every priesthood holder that came in there to do the blessing thereafter. And so for the remaining 6 months of his life, our homeward bishop, Stan Collins, our member of stake presidency, others that came in would give the blessings, and I would just anoint. And those of you that do that in your lives know what I'm talking about. At any rate, it was only at the last night of his life, our son, we had gotten him out of the hospital after about 2.5 months. The kids remembered that he liked a rock band in Australia called Men at Work. I'd never heard of them. And he liked the beat. He was only 7 years old, but one of the kids put a recording up to his ears in the hospital and he started laughing. So we realized that he was out of the coma, but his eyesight was pretty much gone, but his hearing was great. And so we'll work with that. So at any rate, they released him from the hospital to Tiny Tots, which is a little home for children in Orem here that my father uh, donated his time in designing many years before. In fact, I was beside his Sam's bed one night with my dad, and I said, "Dad, did you ever think when you were, uh, designing this place that you'd have a relative here?" He said, "No." But at any rate, he was there for a couple of months, and then we brought him home the last couple of months. And we brought him home at Christmas, and it was at Christmas that they didn't want us bringing him home because he was still on feeding tubes and stuff like that, going through his nose and mouth and everything. We brought all that equipment. My dad helped me. We brought him to our living room on Christmas Eve, and Dad hired a one of his contractor friends that had a big bushy beard, dressed up as Santa Claus to play Santa Claus. And we didn't know if Sam could see him or not. But when it came time for Santa to get the gifts out and to hand them to every child in the room, he handed Sam a little car and he had to hold his arm up to hold it like this. And we got a reaction out of Sam. He was smiling and he couldn't make very many noises, but we knew he really liked that. And that was precious to us. My youngest brother and his wife were still suffering over that because they weren't there at the time of the accident, and they were not there that night. But they were part of the continuing story as things went on. It's interesting how the Lord works and takes situations like this and uses them as educational tools for each of us. But any rate, Sam improved to the point that we got him out of Tiny Tots. We brought him home those last couple of months. That was when I think of Easter, that's the Easter I remember more than any other. Here's our son. He's a miracle. He's still alive. He's been counted out a number of times. He was in bad shape, but he was there. And you could actually say one word to him, which was hi, and he would say hi like this back. It's the only word he could say. Sometimes he could put two words together, but that was rare. But I always liked saying hi to him. Hi, Sam. He's a third grader, and he would labor to say hi back, and that made my day. At any rate, we took him to a sacrament meeting on Easter Sunday, and before we did, we lined the kids up and took a photo of them in front of the house, and then we wheeled him up he had his own wheelchair, tiny little wheelchair, we took that in, and of course, you can imagine many of these folks in the ward. Back then, we had the Coveys and the Edwardses, and I'm talking about Steve and sweet wife, and we had uh, Lavelle and Patty Edwards. In fact, after Sam's death, all the bishops in the ward called me for the next 20 years and my sons to be home teachers to Lavelle Edwards. I think it's because we had so many boys, but they always got a kick out of that. But any rate, we had some great people. Celeste Taylor was in her 90s. She'd been on the Relief Society General Board. They all came to our home and were using the Doma Delicato on our son, moving his legs and arms and stuff while he couldn't exercise. He became a ward project for the last couple of months of his life. But when I think of Easter, which we have coming up, I can't help but think of that Easter because it was so special. And it was so special mostly to still have him with us. He passed away 2 weeks later, but it was so great that last week of his life, I had to we had to hire nurses to help because my wife was having a hard time with her pregnancy and all that, this on top of it. And we had a nurse named Paula that took him down fishing down by Mona, and they caught 3 trout together. And she told us the story later how happy he was. He couldn't see much, but he could hear. We took him to his old soccer team to see a soccer game, and he couldn't see much, but he was cheering for him, or at least smiling for him, and so on, and was taken down on the field. Got to meet them, and his best friend Nikki was killed in a car accident right after that. So it was kind of interesting. Those 2 boys got to again meet before they were gone. And it was a very spiritual experience. And the last day of his life, the last night, well, actually the night before, he had some very bad seizures, brain seizures, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to get my wife up; she was sleeping, and I went and I just held him in my arms, and I gave him an aspirin, and but he was in a lot of pain, and I put him in bed, and I went and woke her up, which I didn't want to do. And I said, dear, I can't get Sam to settle down. She went downstairs and immediately came back. And I said, dear, you gotta stay with him. I'm sorry. I couldn't, I was there for 10 minutes and couldn't. Says, I went downstairs and he was asleep. So maybe I was keeping him awake. I don't know. But any rate, that was the night before he passed away. And then the night he passed away, I don't know how your good folks are, but I don't get very many dreams that I can remember anything from. And maybe it's the pizza I have the night before or some other thing that sends me into some weird thing I can't remember and probably shouldn't. But my dream that night that he passed away was the most vivid I've ever had in my entire life. And we were flying on an airplane. It was a big plane, and we were the only ones on the plane, our family. And unlike me, I'm usually the driver or whatever. My wife was the pilot of the plane. And we were coming into this huge city. It was like New York with tall buildings, only every building was perfectly white, alabaster type buildings. It looked like we were coming into heaven as you look back on it. And I was telling her, like a backseat driver, to bank the plane this way or bank the plane that way to miss a big building. And all of a sudden, everything opened up like a big central park in the middle of the city. And I directed her to have the plane land here. And so she landed the plane there. And then the dream was so vivid that, I walked Sam out. He was able to walk out to the wing. We went out the door, out the wing. And I remember the last thing was setting him down in this big, beautiful garden in the middle of this park. And he got to the point where he could say bye as well as hi. And I set him down in the park and he said, bye, Dad, just very distinctly like that. And I woke up. It woke me up, and I woke my wife up. And I told her about this dream, and she says, well, you never have dreams that you could tell. I said, you're right, but this one was so, Anyway, I went downstairs where we had our young boys were camped out in sleeping bags around his his bed. He was on the same hospital bed that my mother had passed away in years before because we had kept it. And his little brother, Adam, was in bed with him, who was 6. He had his arms around him and he says, "Daddy, Sammy hasn't woke up yet." And I threw the blankets off him. He was face down against our son's arm, and his legs were a fight. I knew he was gone. And the very first thought that hit me, I'm so grateful for this, was he was your son first. And I'll never forget that thought. It was so very powerful to me. And then I had the very worst experience of my entire life. That was having to go inform his mother that he had passed. And she was still upstairs. And I said, "Dear, Sam's gone." And she started screaming and ran downstairs and picked him up. And nobody could take him out of her arms the next hour. And finally, Dr. Gaffane came, and he was crying because he was hoping, as we all were, that this miracle would continue. But I learned a lot from that experience. The main thing I learned is that the Lord's in charge. And yes, indeed, he was his son first. We just get him lent to us. And we become very close. I also learned that by reading what the prophets said about children that die and so on, that he was the leader now of our family, that he was an heir to the celestial kingdom. I can't say that about myself. I got a lot of things to work on. And I haven't known too many people to be translated. Have you?
Nope.
Not in my lifetime. You know, I've seen some wonderful people, seen some great folks. Of course, the finest of all of them, in my opinion, is my sweet wife, the way she came through all of that.
And that would be the next question I think I would have
You
to
bet.
ask you is how do you go through these many horrible things, you know, dealing with the whole Hofmann thing and then all of the fallout from that and what you've gone through with your son? How do you still hold on to faith? Because some people would say, well, your faith has let you down and all these bad things have happened to you. And how do you rectify if there is a good God who really loves you?
Well, I haven't been perfect. I mean, I've had my moments, you know. I don't want to sit here and say that I had it figured out, because I didn't, and I don't. But I have a very strong testimony of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and I know that God lives and cares for us and loves us. And I know that the Savior is not only our great example, but is our leader, our file leader. And it's the Church of Jesus Christ. It's not the church of anyone else, any man. And you learn to rely. Your faith brings you through. Some people, you're right. When we were tiny tots with Sam for a period of a couple of months there, it was during the Christmas time, just thereafter, and nobody came. I mean, we were the only family out of 40 some kids that the parents came. And then we learned that the 90% of them are pretty close, have been divorced, usually over this child being in there. Born with brain damage, or born with hypocephalus, or born with something, near drowning in pools or other thing. And it nearly destroyed their faith and so on. With us, yes, we had our moments. There were moments when we wondered, you know, what's going on. I remember that Christmas after he died. He died May 2nd of 86. And the Friday he died, I was still scheduled to testify in the Hofmann case on Wednesday. And Bob Stott, the lead prosecutor, asked me if I still want to do that. I said, absolutely. I said, I want to get it done before the funeral. So Sam died on Friday. I testified on Wednesday. We buried him on Friday. That's the way the week went. We waited to get a hold of my dad to tell him, who were traveling in Europe, him and my stepmother at the time. Finally got him the night before. And that was, you know, there aren't a lot of things that people can say when you're in bereavement that mean anything to you. I'm afraid, at least there wasn't to me. Maybe other people get help. We had some people that really meant well and wanted to, so I don't hold anything against them because they had the right spirit and they were trying to help. Like I've said dumb things to people that have lost somebody too. But my dad said something over the phone that night before we buried him. I wanted to check if it was okay to bury him next to my mother and so on because we had an extra place there, and he said that was fine. And then he said something that was really encouraging to me. He said, I bet Sam did a 50-yard dash out of that chair. And of all the things anybody said, that statement from my dad meant the most. I bet he did. I bet he did a 50-yard dash out of that chair.
Thinking about the positive side of it, right?
Yeah. And it got me thinking a lot too about that first thought I had about the Lord, well, he was your son first. And I thought, there were down moments after that. We had some really down moments. One of them was at Christmas. It's interesting. If you lost a person in your family, it's their birthdays, it's Christmas, it's every holiday. And Christmas especially was the biggest holiday for us in our family. I mean, it always has been. It has been for a lot of families. And we usually, on the fast testimony Sunday night is usually when we have the tree there the day before and we start decorating as a family. It's been kind of a tradition over the years after our meetings. And anyway, we had the tree up and we were starting to decorate. We've been to fast and testimony meeting, and among the testimonies that were born that day was one by sweet Nadine Barton. If you remember, I don't know if you remember her, but she's a great artist too. But her husband was a mission president down, I think, in Argentina, and she was. They were going to the temple, which was just down the hill a block, Provo Temple, and in our ward. And her husband was waiting for her as she was finishing up in the bathroom, and she told this in her testimony that day. She came out, and her husband had died. he was dead on the bed.
Oh my goodness!
Well, I guess if you have to go, that's the. I hope I'm not in a bar or something. He was ready to go to the temple. So that's the way to go, Sun trip. I had an uncle, my dad's big brother, that died walking into the Salt Lake Temple. He got a heart attack to see his witness's granddaughter's ceiling. Well, that'd be a short trip.
Right. Yeah. Just doing something good, something positive in the middle of doing something beautiful. Right. Yeah.
And Sister Barton is the one that painted the painting the church, asked her to do on the organization, the Relief Society. So if you've seen that famous painting with Emma standing there and Joseph and so on, well, next time you look at it, look at Emma, because my wife was the model for Emma Smith. And
wow.
And that was right before her son's accident. She's a beautiful lady, and she made a beautiful Emma. At any rate, every time Steve Covey, who was, you'll remember, was in our ward then, and a great friend, and every time Steve Covey saw my wife after that, he always says, well, how's Sister Emma today? so we always got a kick out of that. But anyway, Sister Barton had lost her husband that way, and she got up in testimony meeting to say that she had a visit from him, that he'd come to her in a dream and said, I'm fine, don't worry about me, And any rate, she bore that testimony that, life goes on and that they're happy. Kind of like my dad also said, Sam would never want to come back. And I didn't quite understand that, but I think I do now a little more. We'll understand it a lot better when we're on the other side. But
so true.
Yeah. But it's a little hard. Our vision is still pretty limited here, in this world on purpose. Anyway, so and then we had another, the same fast and testimony meeting that December. We had another lady that was our age, and her husband was also called as a BYU bishop shortly thereafter, and so we had that in common. They had a young family, but they had a little boy that was born, Robert, who had heart troubles right from the beginning. And they had felt impressed to take him up to, at that point in time, this is 35 years ago, up to a specialist in the Northwest, who they felt like through the help of the Lord, I'm sure that's true, saved his life. Performed a little heart operation that saved his life. And later in his life, he served a full mission for the church and all that. So he, it was a real blessing. But at that particular night, after coming out of that fast and testimony meeting, my wife and I are beating each other up because our son died last May. This is the first Christmas without him. And we're hanging, I'm up on the ladder, hanging things up on the tree when we're making ourselves feel a lot worse. I don't know how many of you felt this way. How come we don't get a visit like this? How come we never hear from our son? How come? I mean, the only time I felt my son's presence after his death was walking out of his funeral when they had the coffin going out before, a little white coffin. And I knew he was standing right beside me. And that made me feel happy, but I also was ready to strangle him. What did you do to us? Kind of thing. And at any rate, it was a sweet moment as a dad because I knew he was standing there. I knew where he was, and he wasn't in the box. And that was a blessing, that a mercy. One of the great mercies Lord gave me personally. But here we are, and we're up on the tree, and we're hanging these ornaments. And we're making each other feel worse and worse. How come we didn't get, like Sister Barton or Sister so-and-so, we didn't get any experience like that? Our son wasn't saved, and we didn't get an experience with him. And the doorbell rang right when we were saying that. And it was my little brother and his wife, the ones that had been left in charge. They felt really bad because were down at the MTC when the accident took place. And they looked a little bit long-faced when they came in. We were happy to see them, but they came into the front room, sat down, and my brother Kit said, well, Barbara, his wife, had an experience. Both returned missionaries. Barbara had an experience last night with your son. He says she didn't really want to tell you about it, but I felt like persuading her, so we're here to tell you. I said, really? What was that? And Barbara said, very spiritual young lady, but anyway, she said, well, last night, just as I was ready to go to bed, your son appeared to me, all dressed in white. I knew it was Sam, but he was full-sized, but his face was the same, and it startled me. And I said, Sam, what are you doing here? First, and then he said, well, I need to tell somebody. He says, well, go up here to your parents. He says, they really need a visit or something from you. He says, I've been trying. He says, I've been trying. I can't get through to them. They're so depressed. Can you tell them that I'm fine, that everything's great, and that I'm happy? It's along the lines of my dad saying he wouldn't want to come back. And he said, also, be sure to tell them that I just wanted to thank them for Papa for getting that Santa to come and give me that little toy car at Christmas. That meant a lot to me. And we knew it did. We've even got a photograph of him with his smile on his face, with his hand held up to pick up that car that night. And my brother and his wife were not there. They were not there, but they told the experience. I asked her if she'd write it down, and she did. And that was a wonderful thing. But, I really think that sometimes we miss our opportunities on spiritual events that are happening around us all the time. At least in my case, I'm too dumb to recognize them. But that one was just beautiful, and filled right in. It was, talk about timely.
And, wow. I mean, that is just amazing. I can't even imagine how I would even feel about that.
I haven't told that story to many people, but you asked me about my son, and that was those are special things we think about. Can I just say a couple more things about collecting or whatever?
Yes, please.
Yeah, well, I love collecting, and one of the things I do is look for spiritual things. Maybe just share a couple of things that might be of interest to you. This is one of my favorite letters. Is a letter of George Washington, in which they just got word that Fat George, our king, George III, wasn't going to send any more Germans to fight us. We'd want our independence.
Yeah.
And there was great joy, and everybody was shouting for joy and excited. And one of President General Washington at that time, one of his chaplains a guy by the name of John Rogers of New York, the Episcopal Bishop of New York, hadn't been able to go back in New York because the British hadn't removed, that was their headquarters. I hadn't moved yet, but he wrote a very flowering letter to the general when the word came. He said, and I read his letter in the James Madison Library of Congress and on microfilm, and it said, General, your name's going to be known throughout all our history. He says they're going to be naming cities, streets, towns, territories, states, and even kids after you, which is all true, right? And very flowery letter sent it to Washington. This is Washington's response. Headquarters, 11th June, 1783. And I've got this letter. It's in her collection. I've pictured it in the book. I don't know if you can see his signature there and
Oh,
stuff.
that's awesome.
But in the letter, he says, Dear sir, I accept with much pleasure your kind congratulations on the happy event of peace with the establishment of our liberties and independence. Glorious indeed has been our contest, glorious when we consider the prize for which we have contended, and glorious in its issue. But in the midst of our joys, I hope we shall not forget that to divine providence is to be ascribed the glory and the praise. This was a great man. I mean, he could have taken a bow for that kind of a letter, but he wanted to make sure he gave credit where credit was due. And pretty amazing when you think of how our country came in existence against the greatest power of the seas and the land at that time in the world. It's pretty amazing.
Amazing.
There's a letter of John Adams I like. It was written to Benjamin Rush, his fellow signer of the Declaration, and it was written in old age in 1810. The biggest signature I've ever seen of a U.S. president is John Adams. I got one on a document about this size. The tiniest signature of a U.S. president I've ever seen on a letter or document is John Adams. I've got on this letter I'm showing you is about this size, and in it he writes to him, and Adams, unlike Washington and Jefferson, didn't mind putting emotion in his letters. Washington and Jefferson made it a point not to be emotional because they knew we'd be reading their letters if they were successful, which we are. But Adams didn't care. He was the Harry Truman of his day. He wanted to, him and his cousin Sam that started the revolution, wanted to, they let it all hang out in their letters, okay? And I won't read you all this, but just the end of the letter to his friend, he's being accused of not being a Christian. This is John Adams, and this is how he responds. The Christian religion, as I understand it, is the brightness of the glory, an express portrait of the character of the eternal, self-existent, independent, benevolent, all-powerful, and all-merciful creator, preserver, and father of the universe, the first good, first perfect, and first fair. It will last as long as the world. Neither savage nor civilized man without a revelation could ever have discovered or invented it. Ask me not then whether I am a Catholic or Protestant, Calvinist or Armenian. As far as they are Christians, I wish to be a fellow disciple with them all. That's pretty direct, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so unifying. I really love that idea that he's more focusing on, don't worry about if I'm a Christian. I am, and so are all of those people, all worshiping the same Jesus Christ, which is beautiful.
Absolutely. I've got a letter of, I love Lincoln, of course, and his wife, Mary Todd, gets left out a lot of times. They just say she was crazy and the rest of it, but she was a very loving person, very kind person. The death of their two sons by that time, Eddie in Springfield, and then particularly Willie. Willie died in the White House in 1862. And those of you who would like to read a good discussion on this, my friend Tim Ballard has written a wonderful book on the Lincoln hypothesis. And I would plug that just a little. Those of you know who Tim is. And he's a dear friend. But everything changed with Lincoln and the family after Willie's death in the White House in 1862. At any rate, I have a letter. I won't read it all, but it's a letter from Mary Todd written to a gentleman friend who had lost his wife. His wife had died during the war. And of course, the Lincolns have been down at a party downstairs in the White House when Willie and Ted, who were sick upstairs in separate bedrooms, Willie dies. And they think it was probably from some kind of typhoid or something that he got from the water in the White House or something. Both of them got sick, and the one little boy, Willie, died, and he was 11 years old. And people said that he was the most like his father of any of the four boys. At any rate, in this letter that I have, Mrs. Lincoln sends a picture of a photo of Willie. She says it's not nearly as handsome as he is. He says I have a painting here, the White House, that makes him more handsome. But he's writing to this widower who was a friend and whose wife had known Willie, had been very nice beforehand. He says, please excuse this letter, written in much haste and almost blotted by my tears. When we weep here, we can only remember that there all tears are sped away from their eyes. Sorrow never enters there. And then she ended it. But the letter was beforehand was talking about her son and what they were going through. And of course, they say that she was never the same after Willie's death, and particularly after her husband's assassination. But after Willie's death, as Lincoln would take carriage rides with her on Sunday afternoons. And if you can imagine, that was before we had a Secret Service. So they're out there. Lincoln got shot at a couple of times. They're within 100 miles of the enemy's Capitol building at Richmond. Any rate, the driver of the carriage one day said he could overhear Lincoln talking to Mrs. Lincoln. Now, Mother, if you can't get a hold of yourself, this is after the death of Willie. If you can't get a hold of yourself, we'll have to put you up there. Undoubtedly pointing to the asylum up on the hill. But we forget that Lincoln went crazy too after Willie died. And she would never go back in Willie's room the next 3 years they were in the White House. But Lincoln wouldn't leave his room or his body. And about a week later, they had to come and get the body and get him out of there. Lincoln said later that Mother was driven almost to the asylum by the loss of Willie. And he said, I was driven to my knees. And Tim Ballard talks about that a lot, and other historians about how everything changed with him. He could see that the Civil War would not end quickly. It would last as long, he said in his speeches, as every drop of blood drawn by the lash is paid by another drawn by the sword. He knew at that time that this was God's payment, upon our national sin of slavery at that time. And any rate, it was about the time of Antietam that he got the word from Mary, his wife, that her cousin's son was ready to leave West Point, because he'd been at West Point and he'd had enough. Any of you get sick of school and stuff, he was tired of it. He wanted to leave. And this is the midst of the rough time during the Civil War. Lincoln wrote a letter on this very day to General McClellan saying, save your army at all costs. But he took the time to sit down and write this young cadet. And this is from our collection. Cadet Quentin Campbell, my dear sir. This is 28th of June of 1862. Your good mother tells me you are feeling very badly in your new situation. Allow me to assure you it is perfect certainty that you will very soon feel better, quite happy, if you only stick to the resolution you have taken to procure a military education. I am older than you, have felt badly myself, and know, underlined, what I tell you is true. Adhere to your purpose, and you will soon feel better than you ever did. On the contrary, if you falter and give up, you will lose the power of keeping any resolution and will regret it all your life. Take the advice of a friend who, though he never saw you, deeply sympathizes with you, and stick to your purpose. Sincerely, your friend, A. Lincoln. It's a man that cared, and you can't help but feel that the Lord is guiding such people. And then finally, I just wanted to share my favorite Joseph Smith. We could be talking, the letters of the prophets are marvelous, every one of them. I've got one of Brigham Young where he writes his son Morris. Imagine having 4 sons named Brigham. And
oh yeah.
And so they went by their middle names. So Brigham Morris is serving a mission in Hawaii, Sandwich Islands at the time, and he's having a difficult time with the language, native language. And Brigham writes him back and says, to stick to your courage. Don't allow you to ever, and it was a favorite letter of mine. I probably have the text of it here too, but I wanted to end with a document of the prophet Joseph Smith. This is our favorite, and it's all handwritten.
Oh, wow.
Dean Jesse is our authority living. He's in his 90s now. Been a dear friend for 35 years or more, but I got to see Dean again a couple weeks ago. It was fun. he's a little bowed down now. He says jokingly, he says, "My sins are bowing me down." He's a very dear friend, good man. But at any rate, he told me, he said, Brent, out of about 5,000 pages we've got that were authored by the prophet Joseph Smith, he said less than 50 of them, if you discount that one little tiny journal he kept for a short time, less than 50 pages are in the prophet's own handwriting. And this is one of them, he said. And so it's kind of special. He's just out of Liberty Jail. He's just gone to visit Van Buren and the Congress. We know what happened there. Your cause is just. He's trying to get reparations for their loss of land and lives in Missouri, some understanding from the government. And remember, the Lord told him to take up the cause with the judge and then take it up with the governor. Well, the governor issued an exterminating order, so he's not going to take up much with him. And then take it up with the national government. And so he goes back, and he had Judge Higbee with him. There's at any rate, he visited with Mark Van Buren. Your cause is just, do nothing for you. If I help you, I'll have to help the whole state of Missouri. And that'd be a unique thing for any politician to really help people, I think. But at any rate, the point was he couldn't do anything. And I'm sure glad our politics have improved a lot, right? Over the years.
Sure.
Anyway, so Joseph didn't want to throw the trip away. So he goes to Philadelphia, and they ran a synagogue, a Jewish synagogue. And it holds several hundred people. And the Philadelphia Inquirer, which I think is still the newspaper there in Philadelphia, announced, "Come listen to the barbarian of the West, Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet." And that got a lot of people coming out of curiosity. In fact, more people came than could be seated in the synagogue, so some were outside trying to hear. And he gave a wonderful talk. We don't know exactly what he said. There are those that took notes, but we know that the talk all had to do with family. And I think it would probably fit in conference this weekend, because it was all on telling the men to get back out of the bars and stuff and to take care of their children. And the women should be better mothers and not allow the kids to be running all over the streets of Philadelphia, which he saw as he was riding into town. And then he preached to them the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the lady he was staying with, Susan Conrad, was not LDS at the time. After listening to this speech, and while he was still there, staying at her home, a bed and breakfast, him with the judge, she asked to be baptized. And there were a number of others that did too. So it must have been a very impressive talk on family and on the eternal nature of our lives and the eternal nature of our families, and gives us great hope, to look forward to seeing our loved ones after this life is over. At any rate, he wrote this statement out in her little autograph album. It's supposed to be in her album, but the church has her album and it didn't make the album. So I guess she didn't put this particular page in. She also didn't put one in that Sidney Rigdon had written. And we have a catalog that's coming out next week. It'll be the first one on my stuff. And this will be listed in there just to show it. I don't really intend to sell it. It's got a POR price, price on request, but it's a statement on virtue. And it's both my wife's and my favorite autographs out of all the things we've collected. And here he is, and he didn't have a clerk to write it down for him into her little album. And so he took a sheet of paper and he wrote, "Virtue is one of the most prominent principles that enables us to have confidence in approaching our Father who is in heaven in order to ask wisdom at his hand. Therefore, if thou wilt cherish this principle in thine heart, thou mayest ask with all confidence before him, and it shall be poured out upon thine head, and thou shalt not lack anything that thy soul desires in truth. And again, the Lord shall bless this house, and none of them shall fail, because they turn not away the servants of the Lord from their doors. Even so, amen." Joseph Smith Jr. You can't read that without feeling the inspiration of the prophet of the latter days. It reminds me of a story of when I was a kid still. We had one of Harold B. Lee's two daughters that Maureen, that lived in our ward. In fact, her son, Alan Wilkins, just was released as the temple president down here. He was my campaign manager, dual manager, when I ran for student body president BYI. It's a long time ago. At any rate, good family. And President Lee has just been installed as the president prophet of the church. And Earl Ullman, great professor of all things dealing with bugs and animals, everything else. Uncle Bug, the kids called him. Saw him pull in his car into their driveway. was right after his new calling. And President Lee was getting out of the car, and Uncle Buck went over and confronted him and thanked him for taking on this calling, and gave him his support. He says how great it was that he was our prophet. And President Lee corrected him right there. He said, "I appreciate your sentiments," but he says there's only one prophet in our dispensation. The rest of us are mere caretakers. And I thought that was an interesting comment. I remembered that. And not that we don't worship Joseph Smith, but I think Joseph Smith served his mission very ably. And I have a daughter that's left activity now, and partly is what she's read on the internet about Joseph Smith. Well, that shouldn't be any surprise to us, because we know that his name would be known for good and evil throughout the world. But I can tell you, Joseph Smith was a wonderful prophet of the Lord. The Lord kept him in when he threatened to remove him several times, and kept him in as his prophet. And we can rely upon that. And I think we can equally rely upon President Nelson to direct us, just as all of the caretaker prophets, if we want to use President Lee's words, have done. They were all prophets through the years. I had a son that served a mission. In fact, I count 7 missionary sons and 7 Eagle Scouts, because and I had a Boy Scout museum in town before we got out of scouting here.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, and I, any rate, I count 7 because I think Sam got the equivalent, whatever it was, on the other side of the veil. Life goes on. Each of the brothers, I've asked them, I said, "Did you feel your brother when you were out on your mission?" The oldest son was taken by surprise by that, but he says, "Yeah, I actually did. A couple of times when he was really down." He says, "I felt Sam. They were very close. Because Sam had stolen his bike to race to the corner when he got in that accident." And he says, "Yeah, there were a couple of times I really did." And the other boys all knew I was going to ask that question. And even the 2 that weren't born there felt the presence of their brother on the other side. So I always count 7 Eagle Scout sons, 7 returned missionaries. In fact, we argued to one teacher in school after that in elementary. One of our boys came home and says, "Well, we only have 6 sons and 2 daughters. We had 9 children." I said, "No, we have 7."
Yeah.
Go back and tell her we got 7. He's very much the leader of our family now. It's a position he's in. Any rate, I've gone on too long, but I just want to say that I know the gospel is true. I don't have a question in my mind about it being the word of the Lord. I don't know how people survive these things without the gospel, frankly. But we need to help.
That's what it sounded like. It sounded like that it was the one thing that actually held you all together. It's the one thing that kind of gave you the clarity of motion, that you're able to keep on going and know where you're going and not be totally destroyed by it.
Absolutely, you bet. And I know that it's going to be a joyful reunion when we can finally get our loved ones back together with us. I say that to everyone who's lost. We've all lost somebody, or will by the time you get to my age. I'm 72 now. And the fact is that we have a very loving Heavenly Father. Joseph Smith said right at the beginning, and that's the whole idea of the first vision, is learning the true nature of God.
Yes.
I mean, it set Christianity so-called on its head after Joseph Smith had that vision. We had the opportunity of visiting the Sacred Grove. I visited when I was a kid with my folks. We got to visit on the way to Massachusetts on our last mission. And I don't know how you can stand there and know what happened there and not feel something, because there's a very special spirit there. But that spirit can be in our homes, it can be in our temples, it can be wherever we help bring it there. And the fact of the matter is, the true nature of God is what we're here to learn, first of all. I think anybody that learns that and learns the Jesus Christ role and the role of the Holy Ghost, which is always testifies for the Savior, when we learn their role together and our part in it, and how we are a special part of their mission, we know from the scriptures that the Lord states that very dramatically several places about what his mission is in life. And I have felt that very strongly. There are times where I forget for a while and I have to bring myself back to remember.
That's all of us. That's
Yeah,
all of us.
and I guess I'm really missing this pandemic church is for the birds. And I'm doing Kiwanis
Totally
programs
agree.
and everything with Zoom like I did you, holding things up. Kind of hard to do that with a 6-foot document or an artifact. I'm getting real tired of Zoom. And we had state conference yesterday and it broke up every few seconds. So we had a hard time getting anybody's messages. I love technology. I'm glad our missionaries now can use some of this. We have a mission grandson that's serving in Detroit, Michigan right now. His name is Sam. It's an Allen. It's named
Oh,
after his uncle by his dad, who was the oldest brother. And we feel just very strongly that families are forever. The covenants we make in the temple help to seal that. And I just, I don't think you can put a value on that. I just don't know how you can possibly put a. We have the gospel. We have the Lord Jesus Christ guiding and directing us back to His Father with the Holy Ghost, and we just have everything. I mean, we've got all the blessings we need. We just need to wake up, And I know I do. I still do too. There's a lot of things that we have to gain a testimony of as we go through life. And
yeah.
isn't it great that we've got a Heavenly Father who has uh, unending patience?
Yes, so true. I think that attribute of all of his attributes is one of the
Yeah, because I've got
most
some things.
endearing.
I'm not ready to face him yet, and I know there's a number of things I got to work on. And I'm grateful that I'm not dead yet either. That I still have a little time, maybe, to work on those things. And it helps, though, I think, to know that we have loved ones on the other side of the veil that are pulling for us.
Yes.
That are saying. Sometimes I can almost hear not just my son, my parents, grandparents, who I loved all of them, saying, "Why did you do that? Why did you think that way?" I can almost hear them. If that was a
Oh,
dumb
yes.
thing to do. What did you say that for? And I guess repentance is a continuing blessing. Okay.
It really, really is. I actually had that same thought a lot about my ancestors just being with me. My grandparents died in a fire saving all of their children.
Oh wow.
And so my grandparents, I've never met them. My mom was only 3 when it happened. And so, I often feel them around me. And there are times where they're like, come on, get moving. You're wasting your time. And I definitely feel like they are there to motivate me and to help me to keep going. It's almost like having your own cheerleading team, but you have even more than just the ones you have. You have all of your ancestors.
Oh, you
If
bet. Yeah,
just hoping and
got a lot of them we
wanting the best
don't
for you.
remember. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're all
Yeah.
pulling for us. And but the main thing is that I love that quote from Brigham Young about when we meet our Heavenly Father again. Um, and you probably know the one I mean. I was just looking at that today. Maybe I can share that at the end here. But it meant a lot to me when I heard this. But Brigham Young said, "When you see our Father, you will see a being with whom you have long been acquainted, and He will receive you into His arms, and you will be ready to fall into His embrace and kiss Him. You will be so glad and joyful when you are qualified and purified, you can endure the glory of eternity." Love that quote.
I love that. I know that is very true. I've had a dream of meeting Christ once. A very, very I don't have a lot of dreams like you were talking about before. I haven't had a lot either in my life, but I've had just a one or two of moments like that. And it was just of somebody who totally understood, totally loved me,
Yeah.
just falling into his arms. And he was just ready. And he didn't, and I had been hiding a wound from him that I didn't want to show. And he instantly healed me. And he never was judging. And it was just such an amazing experience, even though that was just a dream, to understand a little more of the nature of who
Well,
God and
we all
Jesus.
have those wounds. You can't go through this life without getting some wounds, you know.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I told my university kids, none of us gets out of here alive.
No,
So
nobody is. And we fear death a little too much, I think.
yeah,
As a
yeah,
society, it's just this big taboo subject. We have to talk about it only a certain way. And after a while, you just kind of go,
yeah.
you know, I've
Well,
almost died twice in my life for sure.
all
So
right.
to me, I'm more cavalier with speaking about it because I feel like we fear it too much.
Yeah.
And
They,
it's just a
they
part of
jumped
life.
off and had a bomb for me too, so I'm kind of glad I missed that. But
Right.
on the other hand, how many times has the Lord? I mean, the Lord will save or won't save from physical or whatever things. Just like my son, I stood by him when he was in the hospital, and when he was in the coma, and I wish that I could take his place. Any parent would. You'd wish that
Yeah.
you could jump in bed and take his place. Um, I had a candy striper run in once when during the night one time when I was with my best friend talking. She said, "Oh, I thought your son just flatlined." I knew what that meant. And then she went back and we were really upset and went back. She says, "Oh, I guess it's just our equipment." Well,
Oh,
his
goodness.
son did ultimately pass, but the fact is that none of us really knows. I mean, we're on a short fuse, all of us. And so we just got to try to gain as much positive experience as we can in this life. Um, but I don't know how people get through this life without a strong and abiding testimony in our Father in heaven and his son, Jesus Christ. I think that was the first thing Joseph Smith learned.
It has definitely made my life totally different to the point where I do have that gratefulness. I have all these skills of navigating that I don't think I would have had if I didn't think that there was a divine being that was trying to have a goal for life, a purpose for it. So
Yep.
I agree with you. And I'm so grateful that you joined me today in talking about this.
Well, thank you for talking with me.
Um,
I appreciate it.
I really appreciated it.
Appreciate the opportunity. Thank
It
you.
was absolutely a pleasure of mine for sure. That was just absolutely wonderful. Thank
Well,
you so much. And if anyone is watching, feel free to leave us some comments and we'll try to answer those as time gives us. So have a beautiful day and thanks.
thanks, Roseanne. Take care. You bet. Bye-bye.